Welcome back, party people. Mike here with The Social Life of Language, and today we're going to be talking about a couple concepts from W.E.B. Du Bois, but mostly concentrating on his double consciousness theory, one of the most important theories of all time, which speaks to race, the experience of racism, as well as racial perception, racial consciousness, and even racial history. And today we're going to learn about all this deep, nerdy race theory, but through comic book superheroes. Specifically, the two best superheroes of all time. Of course, I'm talking about the Afro-Latinx Puerto Rican Spider-Man, as well as the Muslim Pakistani American Miss Marvel. Now, we're going to try to answer a question that I've had for a long time. Something I started noticing that really kind of pissed me off after a while. Basically, I'm asking, why are all the black and brown superheroes so insecure? Like, for real, they come out crying like on every other page.
As great as it feels to be powerful, I kind of want my mom.
But we're gonna go as deep as we can with this analysis, primarily using two texts: The Souls of Black Folk and a separate text called The Conservation of Races, both by Du Bois. Now, these texts have been interpreted and studied in hundreds, probably thousands of books. Today's video is just one more interpretation applied to comic books, specifically analyzing mainstream comic book representations of the United States, which I am asserting is very similar to real life America. So if W.E.B. Du Bois picked up a copy of this new Spider-Man and Miss Marvel, what would he say? Let's find out. Now, both this new Spider-Man and Miss Marvel come from two of the most stigmatized and racialized populations in the United States. Both of them hide their true identities, and both of them do this one thing that annoys the living hell out of me. I kept noticing the superheroes of color cry, like, a lot. That's the pattern. All my favorite black and brown heroes are really insecure. They question every decision they make. They always ask for help and can never just shine on their own. Now, that's totally different from, let's say, the white boy Spider-Man, also a high school kid, but immediately when he got his superpowers, he thought they were pretty cool. Might even use them to get girls, after fighting, the bad guys and whatnot. On the other hand, the Miles Morales Spider-Man was utterly terrified of his powers. I mean, the kid would walk around hugging his backpack the whole time. But why are they so afraid of their own power?
There's already a Spider-Man and he seems to love it. He loves jumping around and being hit in the face and lit on fire. I'm not that guy. Let him do it. But I'm not that guy.
So you see, something's different. They aren't like the big league superheroes. They aren't like Batman, who always knows what's best for Gotham. They aren't like Daredevil, who always knows what's best for Hell's Kitchen. They're not like Superman, who claims to know what's best for humanity in general. The big league superheroes seem to understand that things must be done on behalf of the greater good, for justice and whatnot. And for some reason, my favorite black and brown heroes really only question the greater good. And they walk around like justice really isn't even a thing. So I'm like, why don't my favorite superheroes get it? Let's use two characters that can help us answer this question. Let's do a quick nerdy review of the Afro-Latinx Puerto Rican Spider-Man, Miles Morales, and also the Muslim Pakistani American Miss Marvel, aka Kamala Khan. Now, Miss Marvel can manipulate her body's mass, making her capable of shapeshifting and even shrinking or enlarging herself to extreme sizes. Miles Morales, or the new Spider-Man, or the so-called Black Spider-Man, he has all the usual Spider-Man powers, plus a couple of other things. Now, some might be wondering, can the world represented in mainstream comics tell us anything about race relations in real life? I can answer that pretty quickly. I would say absolutely, yes, and totally. But it's more so implicit than explicit. But also, that's exactly what makes comic book racism very realistic. Because in American culture, well, Specifically in white American culture, talking about race is often seen as rude or even reverse racism or some stupid shit like that. So for the most part, we avoid race talk when we can. Comics follow this exact status quo practice, which is precisely what makes comic book representations of race and racism feel very realistic. Now, admittedly, I gravitate towards comics that at least acknowledge the concept race and the experience of racism, because not all mainstream comics do this. Sometimes the concept race doesn't even exist. Or even worse, the concept race is really only deployed as really gross racial stereotypes. But every now and then you get some good stories from authors who know how to present the concept race via nuance instead of just blunt stereotypes. So in general, I would say the norm in mainstream comic books, the way that they present the United States, is to pretend that race doesn't matter. You know, kind of like the real United States. Race is everywhere, structuring everything, but many folks pretend as though they're entirely unconscious of it. And it's exactly the same in mainstream comic books. But what's useful about comic books is you get to analyze life in frozen illustrations. So you get a lot of time to think about the situation. And one of the fun parts of reading comic books is you're supposed to be thinking about why a character does this or doesn't do that, or why do they behave this way and not that way. And when you start thinking about race on that level as a matter of experience and not just skin tone or hair texture or eye color, when you think about it as a matter of experience, you notice different things. You notice how the experience of race and racism affects how you approach the world. You notice race on a higher level of consciousness. Now, for me, I wanted to figure out why my black and brown superheroes were so insecure, why they couldn't make basic decisions, why they were never confident enough to handle situations by themselves, and why they can't just decide what the greater good is or what justice is. So let's think about that. The biographical backstories of these two heroes are extremely unusual. It's one of the few times I've ever seen a mainstream comic book talk about race, where race and heritage and culture is actually central to the character's backstory and not just ignored or eventually whitewashed away. In these comic books, Miles Morales is explicitly identified as Black or as Afro-Latinx. Our other hero, Kamala Khan, is explicitly identified as a Muslim Pakistani American, and so much of her backstory involves her family and an elder from her mosque. Plus, she literally talks about her brown skin, and even more crazy, her brown skin is a choice. Because she can shapeshift, that also means she can race shift. In fact, when she first discovered her powers, she accidentally turned into her favorite superhero, Carol Danvers, or the old version of Miss Marvel, the white lady version of Miss Marvel. So I started thinking, if Miles and Kamala know they are racialized people, do they also think of themselves as racialized superheroes? Because that would change things. Because what if my superheroes weren't actually insecure? What if instead they were just being really, really cautious, really, really careful? Specifically, maybe they were being cautious in ways that a white male billionaire would never have to consider. You know, for example, Batman or Iron Man. So eventually this started becoming my new question. What if my favorite superheroes aren't insecure at all? What if they are just really, really careful because they are fully conscious that they live as racialized persons, as racialized superheroes in an anti-Black, anti-Muslim, white supremacist comic book America? You know, kind of like real America. So check out these moments that display a super high level of racial consciousness. For example, Miss Marvel immediately knows to hide that she's a Muslim American because her abilities might position her as a potential terrorist.
I have to hide. The police, they can't know it's me. And my parents will freak. The NSA will wiretap our mosque or something. And then they'll sell me to science.
Or Miles Morales, a black masculine presenting teenager, he is often pictured questioning whether or not the NYPD could be trusted in various situations. He even gets the talk that many black boys get about being careful around authorities. And he gets the talk twice from two different mentors, his uncle and his dad. Now think of some other white superheroes. The white Spider-Man liked to nickname himself Spidey Cop, and he even saw himself as an external branch of the NYPD. Batman was essentially besties with Commissioner Gordon and even gave the police department the bat signal. The Flash literally works in a police department, and the police know he's the Flash. But for a character like Miss Marvel or the new Spider-Man, asking official state institutions for assistance is always the last resort. Miss Marvel knows she is a Muslim before she is an American. Miles Morales knows that he will eventually be seen as a dangerous black man on the street long before he is a citizen with full rights. So why is it surprising that Miles and Kamala tend to side-eye American ideals? Now, to be clear, being inside and outside of the bounds of legality and social acceptability, all of that is common in mainstream comics. I mean, all the hiding and secret identities, that's kind of half the fun of comic books. You gotta make sure Granny doesn't find out. However, rarely do superheroes also have to deal with being inside and outside what it means to be an American citizen with rights, where one is always already positioned as a potential terrorist or just another dangerous black man on the street. So not only are my favorite racialized superheroes dealing with hiding their superhero identities from their parents and from their high school buddies, they are also struggling with becoming an acceptable kind of racialized citizen in a patriarchal, anti-black, anti-Muslim, white supremacist comic book America. This reminds me of a quote from Du Bois, who talked about this tension. What, after all, am I? Am I an American or am I a Negro? Can I be both? Or is it my duty to cease to be a Negro as soon as possible and be an American? In a different text, he says, he simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. So that quote points to this feeling of not being totally accepted and feeling like you're split in two, and both sides seem to contradict each other, or what Du Bois called the experience of two-ness. And the thing is, racialized folks can be fully conscious of the split itself. They can be conscious of themselves as racialized folks that are also viewed by other people who also believe they are racialized folks. In a sense, there is a double consciousness here. Actually, let's stop effing around and let's talk about double consciousness theory a bit more. And then we're gonna come back and apply it to both Spider-Man and Miss Marvel. W.E.B. Du Bois described growing up under conditions of white supremacy and the kind of racial hyper-consciousness it can produce, or what he called a double consciousness. To simplify, it's the idea that if you are a racialized person, you will learn to always be looking over your shoulder for the pair of white eyes always judging you, judging your every single move. In other words, white society is always watching, always reminding you that you are first and foremost a racialized person. According to Du Bois, he said, quote, "The world only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, Two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Now, eventually, living under a racial microscope like that will have an effect on individuals. You might start behaving in certain ways in front of certain people. Those behaviors might feel faked or inauthentic, almost as if you're developing a second version of yourself, necessitating this feeling of two-ness or a reality split by a racial color line.
I always thought that if I had amazing hair, if I could pull off great boots, if I could fly, that would make me feel strong. That would make me happy. But the hair gets in my face and the boots pinch, and this leotard is giving me an epic wedgie. Being someone else isn't liberating. It's exhausting.
So clearly deep stuff is happening here, and we shouldn't underestimate the explanatory power of illustrations. Check out this illustration of double consciousness. Note the dark-skinned person looking at himself in a mirror that is being held up by the hands of a light-skinned person. Look at how the dark-skinned figure is permanently looking over his shoulder, or maybe the dark-skinned figure has to grow eyes in the back of his head. This figure could be described as having double consciousness, literally being aware of the self and the white other. You might even say that this figure is literally conscious of other people's consciousnesses. So the way to survive in a white supremacist America, back then and today, folks often feel the need to develop a version of themselves and their identity that is at minimum tolerable to a white supremacist society. Racialized folks watching this video right now will tell you about that tiny little voice always telling you to act right, when often you know that that just means to act white or behave as if you're in this never-ending job interview for the rest of your life, especially when you get pulled over by a cop, or especially when talking to your boss at work or your professor at school, etc., etc. You kind of start feeling like you can't do certain things unless they're seen as respectable by mainstream America. Okay, back to our heroes. Saying that Kamala Khan and Miles Morales have a Du Boisian double consciousness isn't really a mind-blowing observation.
I can't go to the hospital with my best friend. She'll recognize me. And that's when it hits me. This isn't just a costume anymore. This is a parallel life.
After all, they are both from highly racialized, highly stigmatized groups. But also, this would sort of explain other stuff. Specifically, why they can appear insecure in comparison to other big league heroes like Batman or Superman. And this is when I really started wondering, what if their actual superhero identities were also conditioned by a racial double consciousness? Like a doubled double consciousness, so to speak. In other words, do they think of themselves as superheroes of color, even when technically they aren't supposed to have race? Because remember, you can't actually see Spider-Man's skin tone. So his blackness and brownness should not technically be relevant when he's using his superhero identity. And for Miss Marvel, technically, she can be any skin tone that she wants. She is a shapeshifter and even accidentally turned into the older, blonde, white Miss Marvel for a couple pages. So while she keeps her brown skin, she still knows to hide her Muslim identity because she is conscious of the deadly anti-Muslim racism in the United States.
Yep, I can change my face, but I wear a mask instead. There are layers of unpackable crazy up here.
Something else I also kept noticing is when they would fight bad guys, they behaved different from the more standard white male superheroes. For example, and on a very basic level, both Spider-Man and Miss Marvel would regularly worry about property damage when they're in poor neighborhoods.
Guys, that food truck's not gonna repair itself. And why am I the only one who wants to help here?
I can't remember a single time the Avengers, for example, cared about completely destroying a family's entire livelihood. And if you ask them why they had to destroy grandma's apartment building, they'd probably just say there was no other way to do it. Someone like Batman and Superman always think at this philosophical abstract level, where they believe there is this ideal, universal greater good, specifically a version of truth and justice that is the same for everyone, everywhere. Kind of like a set of idealistic principles that are always true. And the white male superheroes tend to believe that they know what justice really is. And they authorize themselves to make life-altering decisions for other people all the time. Think about how much blind white male confidence you gotta have to give yourself that kind of power, to be able to decide who is worth protecting and who is not. So then, maybe it's not that my superheroes can't figure out what truth and justice really are, but as racialized heroes, they know that in America, white men have always been in charge of defining truth and justice, and they get it wrong all the fucking time, especially when attempting to enforce a version of justice that is harmful to people of color. It's no wonder Miles Morales never wants the NYPD to help him, because seriously, who the hell trusts the NYPD? Maybe in that sense, these racialized heroes are posing deeper questions about who should be in charge of social progress.
People with power punching down, taking lives when they don't have to, meeting unarmed perps, even unarmed kids with lethal firepower. That's the world we're inheriting, where violence does all the talking. But we can be better than that. We have to start enforcing justice without unjust force.
In other words, these racialized superheroes are questioning what justice actually means in a nation state where police murdering Black and brown civilians is practically legal. Today, we are in an America that deports children with cancer. So why exactly should Miles and Kamala adopt American definitions of truth and justice? I think what is happening here is our racialized heroes are not quite sure what justice really is. Not because they don't have any imagination, but because they have yet to really experience justice as racialized persons living in the United States. And how do you enforce an idealistic concept that has never been extended to you? Or what if you know that America has a really bad history of enforcing this thing we call justice? You know, as we are discussing this, I'm realizing that it kind of seems like folks like Batman rarely ever think any deeper than their Philosophy 101 undergrad course that mentioned the concept of justice one time in the middle of the semester somewhere. In general, the white male superheroes just don't think at this level. So our racialized heroes see the world differently. Or Du Bois might say that they have the gift of second sight. Du Bois himself defines second sight elegantly in various texts. But for this video, I'll define it as the ability to see through the bullshit. You know something is wrong with society because you can see what's wrong with society. And if in fact Miles and Kamala can see via their second sight, then they also know everything is wrong with this world. And think about it, they are just teenagers, and they are given the responsibility of fixing a corrupt racial world. Now, thinking of that kind of responsibility, who wouldn't be terrified? Who wouldn't cry under the weight of something like that? Who wouldn't be crushed by that kind of responsibility? So my favorite racialized heroes don't stay up late at night thinking about how to lead humanity into the future for the greater good or for truth or for justice. No, they would never claim to know what is best for everyone in their own neighborhood, much less an entire freaking country. But also, they perform their acts of heroism with their community's permission, as in they ask how they can best help. They ask whether or not their help is even appropriate.
Are you with me? We're with you, Miss Marvel.
They often reflect upon their own legitimacy when using violence. And they serve as community champions far more often than they serve as superheroes. In this sense, they are the most radical and most subversive kind of heroes, not just in terms of what they stand for, but how they force us to reconceptualize what justice means and who gets to decide how to enforce it. They make us reconsider what good actually is, as not just a concept, but a verb. I think Miss Marvel says it best.
Good is not a thing you are. It's a thing you do.
There are so many tiny philosophical quotes just like that that make comic books worth analyzing. If you want to read a bit more on this stuff, here are a few texts that can get you started. For the comic books, be sure you write down the exact years, the title, and the author. For the theoretical stuff, here are a couple really fun books that look at race in comics in a serious way. All of these books are super smart and super entertaining. And finally, there is a blog version of this video. I'll put the links below. Well, that's all for today, folks. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and do please donate to the Patreon. You can find all my work on academia.edu or maestromikemena.com. Don't forget to look me up in all the social media places. Once again, this is Mike with The Social Life of Language, and we're done.